All right, hello. Welcome to my channel. And this channel is uh, to serve an educational purpose. And we try to turn you on to different and great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories that you can hang your hat on, cosmologies, and grand unified theories, tour de forces, and magnum opuses. Earth-shattering discoveries that you probably don't know anything about because they come from obscure sources. And we try to help you out with your paradigm shifting and your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. Today is our 29th video that we have done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls, Deception. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered about 20 miles from Jerusalem in 1947, and then subsequent findings over the course of the next decade revealed several hundred volumes of various books, including all of the books of the Old Testament of the Bible, except for Esther, and a lot of sectarian material from the sect that lived there in those caves in what's called Qumran, right there at the Dead Sea, the lowest elevation on Earth, in the middle of the desert. These people lived ascetically, but there is a question as to whether they were peaceful lovers or whether they were violent revolutionaries. But the deception part of the Dead Sea Scrolls is really the shameful way that the international team of scholars handled the material that they were tasked to catalog, research, translate, and disseminate back to the public. But these mostly Catholic priests saw something that they didn't like, some red flags, maybe something that contradicted their religious beliefs, or maybe just something embarrassing, and they began to sit on the work. All the documents, they hoarded them. They wouldn't tell anybody else what they had. They would only come out with a book once every 3 years or something, and those books were on mostly irrelevant parts of the scrolls. And they pretty much kicked the can down the road for 35 years until Robert Eisenman and others began to threaten with legal action and began to organize. And I believe now all the scrolls are, viewable in some way or another. But the generation of scholars who were there when the scrolls were discovered are now old. Their whole career went by anticipating getting to see these things, and they never did. And nowadays they're out there, but people don't really know about them. And what they do know about them is not necessarily the most relevant aspects. But I think that Bajent and Lee here in this book, The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, do a decent job of, kind of explaining what's at stake, what's the context, what was first century, what is the importance of these. And I think they do miss a couple points. Like for me, the main importance is that the Dead Sea Scrolls fill a vacuum. There really isn't a reliable source of information from the first century Palestine. There's the Gospels and there's Josephus, and that's pretty much all they have. And Josephus was the adopted son of the Roman Caesar Vespasian. So he's pretty much a propagandist. You have to, and then if you read Josephus and the Gospels kind of at the same time, you'll realize that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the Gospels. And so they're not reliable either. So the Dead Sea Scrolls step in here and, as a historical matter, there may be some some spiritual content there. But as far as pinning down what actually happened, none of the Gospels are reliable. Okay, so now they're talking about at the end of the War of the Jews, there was the siege at Masada, and all of these zealous Jews committed a mass suicide, which was also reflected by Josephus in a different episode years earlier, where he was made a suicide pact in a similar situation. I believe there were only 40 of them, but he kept winning the lottery to stay alive until there were just 2 people left. And then when there were 2 people left, he talked the other guy into forgetting about the suicide pact, and they ended up surviving. Josephus's story is most likely false, and so this story about Masada is quite likely false also. So, about this mass suicide, they were so Jewish that and so anti-Roman that rather than surrender to the Romans, they would all just commit suicide. According to Josephus, Eleazar concludes, Eleazar is the leader there at Masada for these Jewish zealots that were certainly in communication with the Dead Sea Scrolls writers. There were many different copies of Dead Sea Scrolls material found in the ruins at Masada. Eleazar concludes, "Let us die unenslaved by our enemies and leave this world as free men in company with our wives and children. That is what the law ordains." On occasion, Josephus is unreliable. When he is so, however, it shows. In this instance, there is certainly no reason to doubt his word, and the excavations of Masada conducted in the 1960s tend to support his version of the events. It is, of course, probable that he embellished Eleazar's speeches somewhat, making them perhaps more eloquent and long-winded than they might actually have been, availing himself of some poetic license. But the general tenor of the narrative rings true and has always been accepted by historians. What is more, Josephus had a unique and first-hand understanding of the mentality that dictated the mass suicide at Masada. At the beginning of the revolt, he himself had been a rebel commander in Galilee, which should raise a red flag right there. In AD 67, his forces were besieged by the Romans under Vespasian at Jotapata, near Sepphoris. When the town fell, many of its defenders committed suicide rather than submit to capture. Many others, including Josephus himself, fled and hid in caves. According to his own account, he found himself in one cave with 40 other fugitives. Here, as at Masada, lots were drawn as to who would kill his comrades, whether by chance, as Josephus suggests, or by the providence of God, or perhaps by a fiddle which aided and abetted one or the other. He and another man ended up as the sole survivors. Persuading his companion to surrender, He then himself defected to the victorious Romans. That story is not believable, in my opinion. He does not emerge from the adventure in any very creditable light, of course. But even if he himself could not live up to them, he was no stranger to zealot attitudes, including their preparedness for self-immolation in the name of the law. In reality, there was a fairly sophisticated logic governing such self-immolation, which would not have been readily apparent to Josephus's readers either at the time or subsequently. The mass suicides at Masada, at Gamala, and at other sites are explained by Eisenman as resting ultimately on the uniquely zealot concept of resurrection. This concept derived primarily from two Old Testament prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel, both of whose texts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, was the first to give expression to the concept in any developed form. Quote, "Of those who lie sleeping in the dust of the earth, many will awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting disgrace." He speaks, too, of an imminent kingdom of heaven and of end times, of the coming of an anointed prince, of a son of man on whom was conferred sovereignty. That's in chapter 7, verses 13 to 14 of Daniel. In Ezekiel, the relevant passage is the famous vision of a valley filled with dry bones, all of which God announces will live again. Ezekiel 37, verse 12, "I mean to raise you from your graves and lead you back to the soil of Israel, and you will know that I am Yahweh. When I open your graves and raise you from your graves, and I shall put my spirit in you, and you will live." So important was this passage deemed to be that a copy of it was found buried under the floor of the synagogue at Masada. The concept of resurrection derived from Daniel and Ezekiel was picked up and adopted by the original zealots for the law, the Maccabees. Thus, in the second book of Maccabees, it is used to encourage martyrdom for the sake of the law. In 2 Maccabees 14, verse 42, an elder of Jerusalem kills himself rather than be captured and suffer outrages. In 2 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 18, a priest and teacher of the law kills himself as an example of how to make a good death for the venerable and holy laws. This incident, according to Eisenman, is the prototype for the establishment of later zealot mentality. The principle finds its full expression in 2 Maccabees 7, where 7 brothers submit to death by torture rather than transgress the law. Quote, "Said one brother, 'You may discharge us from this present life, but the King of the world will raise us up, since it is for his laws that we die, to live again forever.' Another said, 'It was heaven that gave me these limbs. For the sake of his laws I disdain them. From him I hope to receive them again.' The next said to his tormentors, 'Ours is the better choice, to meet death at men's hands, yet relying on God's promise that we shall be raised up by him. Whereas for you, there can be no resurrection, no new life.'" Here then, in the pre-Christian book of Maccabees, is the principle of bodily resurrection that will figure so prominently in later Christian theology. It is available, however, as the third of the above speeches makes clear, only to the righteous, those zealous for the law. But there is another point of relevance in the passage devoted to the death of the 7 brothers. Just before the last of them is to be executed, his mother is brought in to see him. She has been urged to plead with him to submit and thereby save himself. Instead, she says to him that, "In the day of mercy, I may receive you back in your brother's company." 2 Maccabees 7, verse 29. At the end of time, those who die together will be resurrected together. Thus, Eleazar, in his exhortation to the garrison of Masada, urges them to die in company with our wives and children. This is what the law ordains, not the law of the Sadducee establishment or of later Judaism, only the law of the so-called zealots. Had the women and children in the fortress been left alive, they would not have been exterminated by the victorious Romans. But they would have been separated from their menfolk and from each other. And many of them would have been enslaved, raped, consigned to Roman army brothels, and thereby defiled, bereft of their ritual purity according to the law. At Masada, separation and defilement were feared more than death, since death for the righteous would have been only temporary. Here then, among the ferocious defenders of Masada, is a principle of bodily resurrection virtually identical to that of later Christianity. The garrison who defended Masada can hardly be reconciled with traditional images of placid, peace-loving Essenes, who, according to adherents of the consensus, made up the community at Qumran. And indeed, as we have noted, adherents of the consensus continue to insist that no connection can possibly have existed between the Qumran community and the garrison at Masada, despite the discovery at Masada of texts identical to some of those found at Qumran and, in at least 2 instances, found nowhere else. And despite the use of the defenders of Masada of precisely the same calendar as that used by the Qumran material, a unique solar calendar in contrast to the lunar calendar of the official Sadducee establishment and of later rabbinical Judaism. Once again, there can be discerned the configuration of what Eisenman has described, a broad messianic nationalistic movement in which a number of supposed factions, if there was ever any distinction between them, effectively merged. Eisenman's explanation accommodates and accounts for what has previously seemed a welter of contradictions and anomalies. It makes sense, too, of the mission on which Paul is dispatched by James and the hierarchy of the so-called early church, the Nazarene enclave in Jerusalem. In biblical times, it must be remembered, Israel was not just a territory, not just a particular tract of land. Even more important, Israel denoted a people, a tribe, a host. When Paul and other evangelists are sent forth by the hierarchy in Jerusalem, their purpose is to make converts to the law, that is, to Israel. What would this have meant in practical terms, if not the recruitment of an army? Since Old Testament times, and especially since the Babylonian captivity, the tribe of Israel had been scattered across the Mediterranean world and beyond, on into Persia, where at the time of Simeon Bar Kokhba's rising in AD 132, there was still enough sympathy to elicit at least a promise of support. Were not the emissaries of the Jerusalem hierarchy sent to tap this potentially immense source of manpower? To call to the colors the dispersed people of Israel, to drive the Roman invaders from their native soil and liberate their homeland. And Paul, in preaching a wholly new religion rather than mustering recruits, was, in effect, depoliticizing, demilitarizing, and emasculating the movement. This would, of course, have been a far more serious matter than merely lapsing from dogma or certain ritual observances. It would have been, in fact, a form of treason. For the law, as it figures in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is not wholly confined to dogma and ritual observances. Running throughout the Qumran texts as a sacred duty, there is clearly a thrust to build a legitimate messianic persona, whether royal or priestly or both. By implication, this would involve the re-establishment of the ancient monarchy and priesthood to drive out the invader, to reclaim and purify the Holy Land for the people chosen by God to inhabit it. In the words of the War Scroll, the dominion of the invader shall come to an end. The sons of righteousness shall shine over all the ends of the earth. Okay, that's the end of chapter 15. And chapter 16 is called Paul, Roman agent or informer. And this is interesting because it comes many, many years before the book by Voskelin and Sheldon that is called Operation Messiah, which does basically finger Paul as a spy, a Roman intelligence agent who's and he really is. I mean, when they go through his, it's like Paul is a walking false flag attack. Every place he goes, there's like an insurrection, and he gets away usually with Roman escort, and like then some, but some of the Jews are like imprisoned and stuff. So you know, and I mean, it's Paul is definitely his agenda is so far off what Jesus' so-called brother James and the Roman and the Jewish zealots are all about, that you have to wonder where, you know, because he never met Jesus, only in a vision. And he kind of elevates that vision over people who actually like knew Jesus, you know, or so-called Jesus. So this should be an interesting chapter. Paul, Roman agent or informer. With this grand design in mind, it is worth looking again at the confused and sketchy description of the events that occur towards the end of Acts, with Acts of the Apostles. Paul, it will be remembered, after a prolonged evangelistic mission abroad, has again been summoned to Jerusalem by James and the irate hierarchy. Sensing trouble, his immediate supporters exhort him repeatedly at each stage of his itinerary not to go. But Paul, never a man to shrink from confrontation, remains deaf to their appeals. Meeting with James and other members of the community's leadership, he is again castigated for laxity in his observation of the law. Acts does not record Paul's response to these charges, but it would appear from what follows that he perjures himself, denying the accusations against him, which his own letters reveal to have been justified. In other words, he recognizes the magnitude of his offense And however fierce his integrity, however fanatic his loyalty to his version of Jesus, he acknowledges that some sort of compromise is, this time, necessary. Thus, when asked to purify himself for 7 days and thereby demonstrate the unjustness of the allegations against him, he readily consents to do so. Eisenman suggests that James may have been aware of the true situation and that Paul may well have been set up. Had he refused the ritual of purification, he would have declared himself openly in defiance of the law. By acceding to the ritual, he became even more than before the liar of the Habakkuk commentary, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian writings that has the story of the teacher of righteousness, and then there are two, the liar and the evil priest, or something like that, the wicked priest. Whatever the course of action he chose, he would have damned himself, which may have been precisely what James intended. In any case, and despite his exculpatory self-purification, Paul continues to inspire enmity in those zealous for the law, who a few days later attack him in the temple. This, they proclaim, is the man who preaches to everyone everywhere against the law. The ensuing riot is no minor disturbance. Quote, "This roused the whole city. People came running from all sides. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and the gates were closed behind them. They would have killed him if a report had not reached the tribune of the cohort that there was rioting all over Jerusalem." And that is Acts 21, verse 30. The cohort is called out, no fewer than 600 men, and Paul, in the nick of time, is rescued, presumably to prevent civil upheaval on an even greater scale. Why else would the cohort bother to save the life of one heterodox Jew who'd incurred the wrath of his fellows? The sheer scale of the tumult attests to the kind of currency, influence, and power the so-called early church must have exercised in Jerusalem at the time among Jews. Clearly, we are dealing with a movement within Judaism itself, which commands loyalty from much of the city's populace. Having rescued him from the incensed mob, the Romans arrest Paul, who, before he is marched off to prison, asks permission to make a self-exonerating speech. Inexplicably, the Romans acquiesce to his request, even though the speech serves only to further inflame the mob. Paul is then carried off for torture and interrogation. As was asked previously, interrogation about what? Why torture and interrogate a man who has offended his co-religionists on fine points of orthodoxy and ritual observance? There is only one explanation for the Romans taking such an interest, that Paul is suspected of being privy to information of a political and or military nature. I can think of other reasons, but they say there is only one explanation. The only serious political and or military adversaries confronting the Romans were the adherents of the nationalistic movement, the zealots of popular tradition. And Paul, the evangelist of the early church, was under threat from those zealous for the law, 40 or more of them in number, who were plotting to kill him, vowing not to eat or drink until they had done so. Saved from this fate by his hitherto unmentioned nephew, he is bundled under escort out of Jerusalem to Caesarea, where he invokes his right as a Roman citizen to make a personal appeal to the emperor. While in Caesarea, he hobnobs in congenial and intimate fashion with the Roman procurator Antonius Felix. Eisenman has emphasized that he is also intimate with the procurator's brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa II, and with the king's sister, the later mistress of Emperor Titus, the Roman commander who will destroy Jerusalem and eventually become emperor, whose name is Bernice. These are not the only suspicious elements looming in the background of Paul's biography. From the very beginning, his apparent wealth, his Roman citizenship, and his easy familiarity with the presiding establishment have differentiated him from his fellows and from other members of the early church. Obviously, he has influential connections with the ruling elite. How else could so young a man have become the high priest, hatchet man? In his letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 11, he speaks of a companion strikingly named Herodian, a name obviously associated with the reigning dynasty and most unlikely for a fellow evangelist. And Acts 13, verse 1, refers to one of Paul's companions in Antioch as Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. Here again, there is evidence of high-level aristocratic affiliation. Okay, we're going to stop right there and start it up tomorrow at this location, on this channel, at this time of day. So please come back and tune in. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great